how does the variability of 1 rep max values affect the reliability of percentage-based programming within strength and conditioning? So I guess this is the cornerstone of why I started using velocity-based training all those years ago, which was essentially VBT gives us the opportunity to manage and measure strength levels today. And I think all of us who understand physiology is not linear, physiology is fluid. Your strength level today is really, really important. And ultimately, I guess without the integration of technology, we don't know how that fluctuation has gone from day to day when it comes to measuring 1 repetition max and then prescribing based off of repetition max that was done anywhere between 2 days ago to 5 days ago to 3 weeks ago. So I guess the most important thing for me is we can measure and objectify strength levels today, integrating velocity-based training. And that allows us to basically swing the pendulum, whether we up or down regulate a training session based on where the person is today. And I think that's the most vital thing. So in terms of percentage-based programming, I think it's really important to, I guess, emphasize that velocity-based training scores really align closely to percentage of 1 repetition max. So by that, 80% of 1 rep max for a squat, for example, is essentially a movement speed using velocity at 0.54 meters per second. That doesn't move irrespective of load on the bar. So I guess this is another really key point, and it's a good educational point for players and athletes as well, that lifting 100 kilos today at 0.54 is developing the same strength qualities as lifting 120 kilos at 0.54 next week. And I mean, that's a big, heavy swing. I know that's just an illustration of the point. But that, I guess, is the most important thing for me, which is the velocity score aligning with rep max is very, very stable. And then we can prescribe based off a velocity score and not necessarily a percentage-based training program that may or may not have been built, like I say, historically over the last 2 to 4 weeks, for example. I guess, how do coaches address the challenge of fluctuating 1 rep max values when prescribing training loads based off specific percentages? Well, I guess this leads into things like acute levels of fatigue as well. But I guess to answer this in terms of a practical application sense, the realities for me as a coach would be having fixed load preparation sets that give me an indication as a coach of where somebody's going to sit on that kind of readiness continuum for their training session for that day. So I guess, like I say, from a practical application standpoint, I'm looking as a coach for a fixed load in a warm-up set that's going to allow me to make an initial assessment on whether that person is ready to do the training that's been written and prescribed, or whether we're going to have to make some modifications as a coach. So I guess that's going to be contextually specific to different environments. But historically, for me, I'm a very biased towards the hex bar. I'd like to see a warm-up set for players who've got a strength development type session to lift at 70% of 1 rep max, which obviously aligns with the velocity score at a specific speed, to see whether they're basically ready to train in a prescribed manner or whether we've got to make some modifications. So that's, I guess, another reason why the fluidity of our programming has got to be adjusted and modified in the moment. So it's great having a template. It's great having a structure to your training and what you want to prescribe. But I think we all know there's lots and lots of moving parts when it comes to team preparation, particularly, especially in running-based sports, collision-based sports, which is historically where I've come from. And ultimately, from a coaching standpoint, we have to make decisions in our gym sessions that are going to impact on our players, I guess, quality of outputs, and also not layer on another level of fatigue that's going to challenge them in terms of recovering today or performing in their future competitive outputs, which may be between 3 and 1 day away. What alternative approaches can be used to account for the fluidity of 1RM to ensure effective programming? I guess it's to answer this one, I mean, I have seen these in advance, but I want to sort of answer them on the fly as much as I can as well. I mean, from our point of view as coaches, there's always going to be modifications. And from our point of view, from that perspective, we're always going to have to modify based on some key sort of, I guess, performance indicators. That one final preparation set before we get into our main lifting being one of the kind of key cornerstones for me as a coach, which is, am I going to up or down regulate based on what I see there? Especially if athletes are giving you maximal intent, then from our point of view as coaches, you know that if effort's there, then hopefully we're going to have the sort of necessary outputs from the player group as well when it comes to, I guess, diligence and compliance to sort of execute their training to the best of their ability. In terms of approaches, I think that is the sort of handbrake for me. It's that final preparatory set that's going to go into your main work, and ultimately from there, it also, to be fair, may opportunity to ramp towards a working set, and there's a lot of different factors that go into that as well. You're going to have things like players training age, especially if you're working with a broad spectrum of age ranges. If you've got a professional sports team, there's going to be young players in their early 20s. There might be players into their 30s and early 30s who need a different level of kind of coaching and modification in terms of those volumes and intensities that they may or may not be being exposed to in the main training units that they're taking part in. How to identify acute levels of fatigue accurately and what to do next. So I guess all of these things within the integration of velocity-based training kind of align with each other. So we're making coaching decisions within the weight room. I think these are really important things that, from my point of view, I always come back to kind of put my coaching hat back on, which is always about, am I going to make decisions as a coach to make the better or to make athletes better and the outcomes within their training units better? So in terms of this, what are the practical methods for accurately assessing and managing acute levels of fatigue during a training session? I guess from a delivery standpoint, when it comes to forgetting about your preparation sets and you're getting into your main work, I mean, one of the key ones for me here would be the first rep and the last rep of your first set being really, really good indicators of how much the loading that you've just delivered to a player has had an effect on their, or two things: assessing their readiness and their and assessing how hard that set particularly was within that delivery. So the first rep of the first set will give us an indication of a player's strength levels for today. Going back to the squat or the hex bar deadlift analogy, essentially 80% of 1 rep max aligns to 0.54 meters per second. So if I want to do a set of 3 to 5, and I always have a little bit of framework and bandwidth, and this is down to sort of my contextual specificity, I suppose, when it comes to what I look for within a training program. I'm not very prescriptive and very tight when it comes to it's 3 sets of 5 or it's 3 sets of 3. I'm much more prescriptive around a bandwidth, and that may be something that the group would like to talk about another time, or part of our kind of Q&A at the back end. But from that point of view, if we're asking a player to lift the first rep and we understand their physiology, we understand from their load velocity profiling that they've got a specific strength level that we're comfortable and we understand, then if they're not lifting their first rep of their first set at 0.54 meters per second, but we want that relative intensity within our programming, then that tells us something about acute levels of fatigue potentially. It also tells us that potentially we've got our loading wrong and that it may have been too heavy or too light. But that will also be told to us through the last rep of the first set in terms of what speed that was and basically the bandwidth of drop off between the first rep and the last rep, and how steep the drop off was between that first rep and that last rep. And in my case, that might have been the 3rd rep, the 4th rep, or the 5th rep, depending on how that athlete's felt for that given set. So there's a little bit of coaching decision making around the velocity based training integration as well. It's not just we're just going to do a set of 3 or a set of 5. We're actually going to have a look at the velocity scores from rep 1 to rep 5 and see where we've got a bit of push and pulling to do. And that, I guess, is, like I say, a bit about the coaching journey as well for you as a coach. It's always about a coach and an athlete's relationship, and it's always about modification set by set. Very rarely, in my experience, have I got a session so right that every single set has gone to plan in accordance with, I planned, 3 sets of 5, and the athlete actually delivered me 3 sets of 5 if I'm looking to develop maximum strength as that strength quality that we're after for that particular session. So I think that's the first thing: first rep and last rep, and the understanding of the velocity drop off between that first rep and that last rep, and did we get our load prescription right through the manipulation of training load. How can coaches adjust training parameters to modify the sessions to appropriately address the observed levels of fatigue? Brilliant. That's great. So one of the things that players are good at, Working out how to do as little as possible sometimes. Not all players. There's some players who are extremely diligent and love the gym. But in terms of this question, my answer here would be bandwidth of sets and reps. And depending on the physiology of the athlete, and we've done a little bit of due diligence before they get into their main lifting, have a framework and have a bandwidth. So I know this sounds or may sound a little bit facetious, but it's actually I'm being truthful here. I have a 3 to 5 sets of 3 to 5 reps as a general framework of how I'm going to structure and deliver my strength training, depending on the acute levels of fatigue that I see in an athlete when I'm actually delivering within the gym setting. So in real terms, what that might be is that if we're going to look to develop a strength quality, maximum strength in this particular example, and we've got someone who's a little bit more fatigued and someone who's a little bit fresher, one of those players might end up doing 3 sets of 3 by manipulate loading for the particular day of training experience, of training exposure. The other one might do 5 sets of 5. It might be that one of these players is 20 and one of these players is 30. So again, it goes back to our, I guess, coaching intuition around connecting with athletes and understanding that not all athletes are robots and not all athletes are ready to train at the same level on the same day at the same time. So that would be one thing to answer this question, would be have a bandwidth and also integrate using the velocity drop-off feature within our velocity-based training devices, which allows us not to overstretch players when they're feeling a little bit fatigued. And it also allows us to push players on if they're feeling particularly fresh. Hopefully that concept makes sense, and maybe we can discuss that at the end. But that is, in essence, is where I think the real value in velocity-based training is, which is understanding the strength level of a player today and manipulating the loads and managing, importantly, the loads, so that those who are more fatigued maybe get less of a dose but can continue to make forward progress, and those who are more fresh and ready and maybe younger and maybe less beaten up in collision sports, in my circumstance, there's lots of different people who would have to sort of down-regulate given training age and actually respond better to less volume. And so again, it's a yin and yang and a push and pull when it comes to understanding your players and what they require on any given day. And I think that's the beauty of VBT, because you can integrate that process so that some may do more and some may do less. And you can track that longitudinally to make sure that in terms of actually the volume required to develop and drive adaptation is enough for all players over a training block and not necessarily in a single training session setting. How to integrate velocity-based training without interrupting the daily training process. Well, one of the reasons why I love, and this isn't just a plug for output, but the reality is the size of the unit. I did it. Here's one I prepared earlier. Here, you can't even see it because of my background, but I've got my AirPod case in front of me. I mean, the fact that we've got a really, really small portable device allows us almost to hide it. I mean, it's not invisible, of course, because it sits on the bar if you've got the bar mounted feature. But I think the best example I can give here from a practical application standpoint is twofold, which is it starts with coach and athlete education, or athlete education particularly. I've been lucky in my career to go into various performance environments. And I think one of the best, in terms of integration, one of the best things I've seen, and this may have been a process that's taken a relatively long period of time, but I went to one of the professional rugby teams in England, giving you a clue, they just won the Premiership. And what I saw there was players taking ownership of understanding the metrics and understanding the functionality of the technology so that they self-administered the dose of work that they were required to do through understanding the use of velocity-based training and doing it on their own without a coach sitting right on top of them. Obviously, that's going to take some coach and player education. It's not just going to start in the first session of a new training block or a new cycle and new intake of players. But that's the sort of thing for me as a coach is best practice, which is teach the players to understand and use this technology so that they get the best out of this technology, and they obviously integrate that into their performance programming. So that would be the best way to embed it for me seamlessly, is ultimately teach the players how to use it and why they're using it. that's gold standard, and I'm sure that's not the case in a lot of different programs. But the other thing is metrics at the beginning of sessions that are going to be valuable for you as a coach from an insight standpoint. So things like readiness, particularly. I mean, I know in performance sport environments, there's lots of different technologies that can help you do your monitoring. That's absolutely fine. But when it comes to your gym sessions, understanding where the players sit on that continuum of fatigue and readiness is really, really important. So an unloaded bar jump squat, 20 kilo bar, 15 kilo bar, depending on which programs you're working in. Do a set of 3, jump as fast as you can. Obviously understand the mechanism of what you're looking for and all that sort of stuff. But embed some of the key metrics within your warm up or your training process. And because the devices are so small, and it doesn't just have to be obviously outputs, but ultimately that is embedding velocity-based training into an athlete's training process and not making a huge deal of it. But obviously from our point of view as coaches, we want to track that data because we want to use that data effectively when it comes to our programming and our decision making. The other thing that I've done really well when it comes to integrating it as smoothly as possible, if you have time with the player group, and ultimately this is about making decisions as a coach as well. I mean, I'll give you a frame of reference from my work when I was based in Seattle with a performance program there. Again, like I say, I've always biased the hex bar deadlift when it comes to lower body strength development. So I would have 3 or 4 fixed loads set up when it came to managing the sort of velocity-based training element within my training program. And players understand their own sort of training needs. They understand where they sit on their strength levels, on the continuum of how strong they are, and they understand where they are, whether they're a 150 hex bar deadlifter, a 175, a 200, a 225, whatever it may be. And that would be something where I would use those fixed loads to be almost like a citer. Have a little look at where they are for the day after their preparation sets, like I said before, and make sure that we're getting the right appropriate loading for that given day. And I guess because there's relative invisibility when it comes to the tech, you don't then have to make a big deal of it. But ultimately, I think the other thing about this is engaging players in their training process. And those who do care about their numbers and also layering on how they feel against the fixed load gives you, again, as a coach, a really good opportunity for that coaching moment, which for me is what it's all about. Yes, we've got objectivity of velocity-based training data, but we've also got touch points within training sessions where we have conversations and we understand reps in reserve and we understand RPEs and we understand how hard was that for you. And if I'm paying attention when I'm a coach and I see a 20-25% velocity drop off between rep number 1 and rep number 3, I know that load is not the right load for that player on that given day, because 3 reps with a drop off of 20% there's an inherent underlying mechanism of an element of acute levels of fatigue there that I then have to make some adjustments from a set perspective for the next set and the next set after that. So I guess that would be the smoothness of it, I guess, is a difficult one, because I actually think that we as coaches want to make our athletes accountable to the process and the numbers that they drive, but also equip them with the tools to train when I've got 20 players in the gym, 2 or 3 of them who can take ownership of that training process and not ask me how to work the interface because they know how to do it themselves. And that ownership is really, really important, I think, for the effectiveness of the program. It's not just that particular team that I've mentioned who are very, very good at that. There's another team based in the southwest of England as well who are brilliant with their VBT, and players taking ownership and accountability for actually navigating themselves around those iPads or interfaces. And I think that as a coach is something that's really important for us. Whether we want it to be invisible or not, I think we've still got an opportunity within this piece to really, really have a coaching moment and have a good conversation with your athlete population. Yeah, so this has come from academically credible sources, Adam. Like I say, there are some extra reading that we can potentially provide at some point in time. I'm not sure whether today's the day to gather all of that intel in terms of the peer-reviewed studies. But yeah, so when I went back to one of the questions, I think it was relatively at the top end of the workshop. Yeah, this data is very, very stable. So what you've got here, that 80% 1 rep max for the squat, particularly 0.54 meters per second. This data is basically referring to the normative data around the squat. And for those who are new to velocity-based training, minimum velocity threshold is exercise specific, just to add that level of detail into this. So for 99% of people, 80% of 1 rep max aligns with the 0.54 meter per second velocity when it comes to squat and squat intensities. So this data comes from, the screen doesn't allow me to see exactly who, I can see Helms et al. And De Hoyer et al. But yeah, in terms of the credibility of the research, this is that peer-reviewed research that obviously aligns intensities with bar velocity. So yeah, it's credible, and it's not just something I've plucked out the air. Hopefully that clears that up, Adam. But yeah, also no, brilliant. Yeah, no, talk away. But the one thing that I think is great about that, if you can get that slide back up, Kelly. That if we're looking to prescribe a load, and we've talked about percentage-based training briefly and how that human physiology fluctuates from day to day, if we want that first rep on that first set to be in and around 80%, and we can be as pedantic as we like. I mean, 0.55 or 0.53, does that really matter? Not particularly. But if it's in the 0.4s, we know even from rep 1 with an athlete giving their maximal effort and their maximal intent, we know that we've got our prescription wrong to start with, because the load for that day is going to be too heavy based on the velocity scores that they've produced, even off the first rep of their first set. If we added too much load to that particular barbell or hex bar or whatever exercise it may be. So yeah, I mean, for me as a coach, one thing I really like about these tables, I understand that 95% of 1 rep max aligns with the 0.33 squat. That is exceptionally heavy. And I personally, as a coach, don't really want to go too far towards minimum velocity threshold. I want to kind of keep my players or my athletes in and around the sort of 80 to 87% mark. So I'm talking about a 0.54 to a 0.4 is kind of the ballpark of bandwidth that I want, in terms of, I understand that's heavy, but I also understand it's not really, really crushing them to the point where they're going to get to either a technical breakdown of that lifting or they're getting too near to I guess 100% intensity, which for me is, you know, going to add a layer of central nervous system fatigue as well. So I don't want to layer another element of fatigue onto them when they've already maybe got the other training demands that have done that for them. But hopefully that answers a little bit of that, Adam.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I was wondering, I'm guessing it's different for bench press, bench pull, clean, ollie lift variations, etc.
Yeah.
Because again, there's loads of variety of numbers out there.
No, absolutely. So I think the next slide down actually is the upper body variations as well. So I've got it up, some bench and bench pulls and bench some pull-ups, some others. Yes, because minimum velocity threshold is exercise specific, you're then going to have a 60% or a 70% or an 80% for your bench press is going to be different to your squat, because the two lifts don't have the failure point at the same velocity. So yeah, there's a little bit, and understanding that's great, because if you do have that kind of, I guess, either displayed on a wall or on an iPad or somewhere for your own coaching, when you see those numbers, or when you've been exposed to those numbers long enough through velocity-based training and prescription, you'll recognize what really hard looks like. You'll recognize what hard looks like. You'll recognize what too easy looks like. And if you've got that frame of reference, it's really great from a coaching standpoint, because you can then see that, I guess, that loading and the push-pull being really quite easy to modify just at a snapshot versus, just leave me a minute, I've got to go and refer back to a table. But that's valuable information for sure.
Toomsy, I hope you don't mind me jumping in here. On the bench pull, is this applicable to a Pendlay row as well? Same.
Good question, Sam. I recognise the voice. I can't see everyone on the. No, I won't lie to you. I've not been exposed to the Pendlay when it comes to velocity-based training myself, so I can't say yes or no. Mm-hmm. I would hazard an educated guess that as long as you can keep your torso, still, and you're not focusing on, the technical element of the lift, I would say it would potentially aligned, but I've never really done any prescription myself other than bench pull, bench press. And I mean, me personally, from a pull-up standpoint, I don't usually use velocity, but the horizontal bench and bench pull variations, they're great, and they obviously align with these numbers really well. I haven't done any, mate. There's a little research project for you to do right there.
And then moving on to the second question of Olympic lifts. What's the applicability of VBT within Ollie lifts?
Nice question. I think, Adam, you were kind of referring to that as well, weren't you?
Yeah, I've been trying it on Ollie lift regression. Like clean pulls, certain types of derivatives, and it's very variable at the moment. That
would without doubt be my reply to both of you who asked that question. Again, using me as a frame of reference, who I've not integrated velocity-based training into the Ollie lifts for that exact reason, Adam and Sam, which is the variability. Bearing in mind, I'm guessing you work with sports players, not Olympic weightlifters. Technical accomplishment when it comes to Olympic lifting has a massive bearing on the quality of each rep. And if you're a sports player, you might have a fantastic rep and you might have 2 terrible reps within the same set. If you're an Olympic lifter who's literally, that's what you do day in, day out, then with good Olympic lifters, I would integrate velocity-based training. With sports players who are not Olympic lifters, they're sports players, I tend to stay away just because of that noise. And I think you don't get the value from the device because 1 rep's good and 2 reps are poor. And that's also going to allow for a little bit of ambiguity of understanding of the player as well. The difficulty or the coaching moment on the flip side of that may actually be that what a good lift looks like from a velocity score point of view is a coaching moment, but I don't know whether the kind of gray area is worth the kind of challenge of trying to educate an athlete that what's good and what's bad from a feedback perspective. Do you know what I mean?
Sam should refer to his year 2 lecturer.
No. Oh, hello, Nathan.
Hello.
What would you, actually, this is perfect. This is exactly what a workshop's about and not a webinar. Nathan, you come from an Olympic weightlifting background. Just give us a little story on, or either validate or quash my thinking around what I've just said.
No,
would you as a coach use Olympic weightlifting? Would you use VBT with O-lifters who are not O-lifters, but they're using O-lifting to develop a physical quality?
No.
No. Okay.
No. I mean,
nice.
you as you said, it's very much down to that technical nature. If they haven't got that good 5 years of training behind them, they're probably not going to have the technical proficiency, and ultimately you're only looking at speed of bar. And we got to remember there's changes and measures between what is peak and what is the mean through these as well. Then that's going to change.
Yeah, and I also think, just to reinforce while it's come into my head, Adam particularly, the size of each lifter is going to vary hugely as well. I mean, again, using me as an example in my contextual environments, I've got, rugby players who are 6'5", 6'6", and I've got some who are slightly shorter than that, 5'7", 5'8". And I think the disparity of personnel and the disparity of the quality of their lifting makes it, not as valuable as I think it might be in the sort of traditional compound lifts. That's probably my honest answer of how I've applied VBT, which is not going down the Olympic lifting road. Not to say I wouldn't with an Olympic lifting group, but not sports players. In terms of how to use VBT to unlock the natural competitiveness and spirit, natural competitiveness of athletes, this is another one of those real key bang for your buck winners for me. And I'll give you, I mean, I don't want to name them, but for those who do know me, they know some of them, I've worked in cricket, and cricketers weren't as diligent as rugby players when it came to developing their physical prowess when it came to their sports performance preparation. So I guess if you get to professional level at sport, you've got some inherent competitiveness, because getting to the top in any sport is hard, and it is going to drive the alpha competitor in most people. But I think one of the things that really helped me get a level of engagement with players was the integration of velocity-based training. And as long as they were technically proficient in their lifting, chasing speed, drive output is a win for us as coaches. So for context, it might be something as simple as to develop speed strength. You want to move a unloaded bar at 1.5 meters per second or faster. Okay, great. Give me 3 jump squats. Great, brilliant. You're 1.57. Next player, gets higher or lower. There's a bit of banter. There's a bit of, competitive juice starts flowing. That might be the first little bit of kind of introduction to driving intent through athlete peer-to-peer competition. And actually, I found over time, and it wasn't just within a cricket program, but within rugby programs as well, that there then started to be that real peer-to-peer push, which helped all of the athletes deliver better training outcomes for their training group because they all got competitive, or at least those who were competitive pushed the others to become competitive as well. So it might be something as simple as just a jump squat with a fixed load. Everybody's using the same load, which, arguably may or may not be the best practice, but inevitably it's absolute score. Can I move a 20 kilo bar faster than you? You might weigh 80 kilos, I might weigh 100, but that's by the by for this particular example. That was one of the things that I think was really, really effective. It's driving competition through obviously output, not the brand, but the effort. And then I guess the other piece of that would be, again, bringing it back to coaching moments. Always, it's about technical proficiency of lifting first and objective data second. So using a hex bar as an analogy, there's no point asking someone to do a hex bar jump with 50 or 60 kilos and then really kind of using their arms to get a higher score. We actually want technical excellence and technical application first. And the secondary benefit of that is producing a number for us to use as a competitive driver. So those are the things that, from a coaching standpoint, get your technical delivery right first as a player and not cheat to get a better number versus just chase a number. So we've got that coaching interaction piece again, which is don't just chase numbers, but actually deliver a really good quality, really powerful stimulus. But the technical execution has got to be top of our agenda from a coaching standpoint. And that's the environmental thing that I think gets people on the hook as well. And there might be, again, it's about contextual specificity. Depending on different environments, it might be that there's certain exercises, and I found this over the last month or so when I went into Europe with particularly football, soccer, depending on where you're from. And a lot of people starting to, they're trying to implement velocity-based training and they don't know how. And the first thing for me would be, okay, in an ideal scenario, I want to load velocity profile every player. That's a non-negotiable for me. But I've also historically come from an environment where strength training is part of standard operating procedure, whereas in football, in some environments, is not standard operating procedure. So you've got to start to embed things more slowly potentially. But jump squat, a fixed load hex bar, and what I'm seeing in football, I don't know where everyone's from on the call, but a lot of people want to start seeing more single leg variations being researched. And I don't know how many researchers are on the call either, but it'd be great to have some conversations around that. But that for me would be 3 key things. One at low load, high velocity. So one end of the spectrum. And then even if your single leg work is where you're getting your strength stimulus from, let's start looking at what the Bulgarian split squat looks like at 0.5 meters per second. Let's start looking at what a hex bar, essentially clean pull, looks like at 1 meter per second. So we've got a whole broad spectrum of strength qualities where we've just embedded a little bit of velocity-based training, which will get that intent that we're after. And that's where we're going to drive our adaptations. And that's where we're going to drive our training environment to produce better transferable skills for the field, transferable qualities for the field. So I guess the competitiveness leads into gathering data around different strength qualities that we're trying to develop, which inevitably will allow us to provide the sport coaches with better athletes. I guess how can coaches effectively communicate the competitive benefits of VBT to athletes? I I kind of have probably answered that within the last 2 or 3 minutes, but peer-to-peer drive, successful as anything, and I think it's actually more successful than a coach driving performance. If peer-to-peer can do it, you'll get the outputs. Again, going back to a couple of rugby examples that I've seen outside of my own rugby practice, you know, Saracens and Gloucester are great at players driving outputs, and that's about coaching and embedding, you know, the velocity-based training within those training environments. So I guess if you're thinking about how to embed this, I would think always across the full spectrum of that force velocity curve: speed, strength, strength, speed, and strength qualities, and what you would do within your environment, and start integrating from there, and not necessarily be prescriptive of it's got to be one thing or another. It could be a multitude of different modalities that allow you to get an understanding of someone's strength profile without actually having a testing day as well, for example. How can coaches use VBT as a tool to engage athletes' general buy-in? I think that kind of has led, or has been kind of covered off when it comes to the natural competitiveness. But like I say, again, I think the understanding that players can gain from this is really, really powerful, because if they are the sort of player who's going to be diligent and obviously drive their own kind of physical development, those who are naturally inquisitive around data, and we live in that data-driven environment and that data-driven world, I've seen an enormous buy-in from players who sat on the fence when it came to training in the strength qualities, particularly around what the numbers actually mean and what are they doing for their on-field transfer and performance. So, but what I'm trying to articulate here would be a player who may or may not have had much exposure to really, really good quality maximum strength training in rugby terms. So you've got people who are pretty good at, say, the strength speed bandwidth. You've got people who are pretty good at lifting moderately heavy, moderately quickly. But in terms of their limiting factors when it came to on-field transfer, it might be that actually they were missing a little bit of max strength. So I guess understanding, going back to that table, Adam, around what heavy looks like and what the percentages against intensity look like, a player who lifts at 0.45 meters per second perceives that weight to be heavy. But actually, we know from those tables and from our own work in the area that they've probably got 3 or 4 reps in reserve. So it's heavy, but it's not really heavy. But what that does, especially if they do want to know about the numbers, is gives us an opportunity, again, from a coaching moment standpoint, to have a conversation with the player around the stimulus we're trying to deliver and the outcome we're trying to produce that has transfer onto the field as its key driver. And if you can marry up the numbers with on-field transfer, that's where players who may sit on the fence when it comes to buy-in actually start to be a little bit more diligent when it comes to the delivery of that stimulus that you're driving. And I think the other good thing here would be some of the work that, I don't know if any, like I say, any researchers are on the call, but Harry Dorrell's work around the actual volumes that you need to drive and create the adaptations that you're looking for. And when it comes to halving the training volume, but getting the same level of outcomes, that for players is an immediate way to drive a level of buy-in. Because what that creates is, okay, so you only want me to do 3 sets? Yes, I do. But do 3 really, really good sets with precise, you know, prescription of load, and give me your full effort. And that's all we're going to focus on today. I mean, they're not just going to do 3 sets as accessories and there's other parts of the program. But in real terms, when you're monitoring and managing the velocity-based training piece, it might be that less is more. And that's always going to get buy-in from athletes, especially athletes who are training multiple times a day. We're nearly there. Yeah, I mean, the two bits here that I've got, which is unlocking the competitiveness of athletes and engaging them, the two really weave together really, really nicely. So a simple and impactful way for coaches to introduce VBT to athletes to pique their interest and enthusiasm. I personally think working across the full spectrum of strength qualities, what I call the mixed methods approach to delivering strength and power training particularly, is always going to, I guess, capture the attention of players who can, like I say, move something light pretty quickly, move something moderately heavy, moderately quickly, and move something heavy, not necessarily that side of the curve is a slightly different sell for players. But the reality is, if you deliver all strength qualities all of the time in various, percentages of their programming, you'll always get an output that you want, which hopefully has field transfer. So I think that's what players, for me, want to know. What am I doing in the gym that's going to make me a better player? And if you can, I guess, objectively add numbers to their programming and their process, then you get the buy-in and you get the athlete's attention, because you think, okay, everything I do here, maybe I know this is driven towards sport performance and not necessarily, we're in the gym to improve sport performance. We're not in the gym just to improve the gym. And if you can get that message across to players, that's where you get the player buy-in, and they kind of tip over to your side of, well, hopefully your way of thinking.
Really great, Toomsy. Thanks for sharing all your wisdom there. I want to take a step further back, and ask, how do you, in the real world setting, deal with when, perhaps the VBT data and say the subjective wellness data doesn't align? A player's reporting perceptually low, but VBT is high, or vice versa. How do you kind of fit VBT data in with all the other sources of information?
No, brilliant, Kelly. There's a slide on that slide deck which has got RPEs and reps in reserve.
We didn't set that up.
No, no, we did. No, we didn't. No, it should be. It's one of the low. Keep going. Oh yeah, here we go. Yeah, that's fine. Fine. No, that you were right. Yep. Okay, Joe, can you see that? Yeah, that's it. Got it?
Yeah, got it.
Everyone, and not just talking to you, Joe. I'm talking to everyone. Yeah. So basically, a little bit like a conversation we had with Adam around velocities and alignments. So you've got up at the top here, you've got reps in reserve or an RPE. So reps in reserve 6 and RPE 4 is the first one. And the squat numbers this is for people who've obviously got some training history. But this helps from that point of view. And the coaching, again, a coaching moment, which is interaction with athletes, which is the numbers are telling me this, but you're telling me that you're not feeling great. So can we align your RPEs with the reps in reserve? That's the first thing. And we can obviously modify and manage their loadings accordingly. But that would be, without a shadow of a doubt, Joe, the subjective markers of fatigue and the objective markers of fatigue do have a level of alignment within this type of framework. But also, you can't discount that if somebody said to me, they've moved this, let's just use the squat, because it's right in front of us, 0.52 to 0.56 meters per second, is 5 reps in reserve. It's a million miles away from 0.25, which is essentially minimum velocity threshold for a squat. But they've come in and reported that as an RPE as a 7 and not a 5. Then, of course, we've got to pay attention to what the athlete's perception of hard looks like for today. But also, I've had historically in the past players who, especially again, like I say, from my context, I've always had collision sport athletes who come into the gym on a Tuesday particularly, and they still don't feel great from Saturday for lots of different reasons. And we've got to manage and manipulate this, down-regulate more so than up-regulate. So there is that alignment with an RPE. So I'm not so rigid in my thinking as a coach that, no, you move that at 0.52 meters per second. So there's 5 reps in reserve, but you've only given me a 5. That could be an RPE of an 8 for somebody who's played 80 minutes on the weekend and made, 15 tackles and made 50 ruck arrivals in my sporting context. So of course I can down regulate, but I also know from those stable numbers, Joe, from an intensity standpoint, that is still lifting in and around 80%. So even if I do maybe modify the training session to do a few clusters instead of a straight sets approach, or I do a couple of doubles instead of a couple of triples, I'll still get a level of training stimulus into my athlete, but I won't continue to beat them up.
Within a rehab point of view, talking late stage rehab, you want to work under velocity at a certain point. Do you think you could use VBT as an objective measure to potentially tick off and take them to that next stage in their rehab?
Yes, for lots of different reasons. I mean, Have you gone? It seems you just muted yourself. It's fine.
No, still
no, that's fine. Yes, potentially. Again, just my own personal circumstances. I've historically used velocity-based training with healthy athletes and not those in that rehab type setting. But I can see, especially if I've got historical data on athletes when it comes to things like load velocity profiles and numbers of specific exercises they do at specific velocities, then from a healthy standpoint, you've got a frame of reference. Say, let's make the maths easy, 100 kilo hex bar deadlift moves at 0.7 meters per second when they're healthy. You've got then the level of velocity drop off that can impact on fatigue of that particular, the muscle groups in the lower body potentially. You've got at least a frame of reference of when that athlete is healthy, they can move fixed loads at, specific velocities, and you can work your way up towards that for return to play or return to next stage, move on to next stage. So yes, I would certainly think you could use velocity-based measures to help inform your timeline process to return to play for sure.
Perfect, thank you.
How to identify 1RM by velocity. So it means, for an example, I do the squat, what to look for in order to compare it to 1RM or close to it?
Sure. No, brilliant. Yes, well, minimum velocity threshold is fixed by the normative data. So for the majority of squatters, I think you can take out the sort of powerlifting, the elite level powerlifters particularly. But for normative data, you're looking at a minimum velocity threshold of 0.25. So that failure point of bar speed. So again, one of the things that actually hasn't been mentioned within this workshop has been rep max testing. So one of the great things I think about velocity-based training and the implementation of it is that actually, because I understand where minimum velocity threshold is, I never have to take anyone to do a 1 rep max test ever again, because I can safely and effectively gather good intelligence across the spectrum. You still have to lift heavy weights to get the best and most reliable predictor of 1 rep max using sub-maximal loads. So, and like I say, a squat at 0.54 meters per second is essentially 80% of 1 rep max. So you can understand a player's strength levels for either today or for today based on the velocities that they move. But I also do think in order to predict 1 rep max accurately, the nearer you obviously go to 1 rep max, the better, but you don't have to ever go anywhere near failure, in my opinion, anymore, because you've got the regression to deal with. That that 0.25 is a failure rate, essentially 100% or essentially 1 rep max. So if you have someone lifting, I don't know, at 0.35 meters per second, you can just regress back to the user, your graphing to get that to 0.25. So that's essentially what I would suggest for, I guess, understanding where someone's max is on any given day. You can regress back from a submaximal load and predict relatively accurately. I still say that in inverted commas.
Great, thank you.
So obviously a lot of focus has been on the big multi-joint exercises. How useful do you think VBT is on that single joint kind of movement exercise? Less, I don't know, attaches the ankle, hamstring, curl kind of thing.
Good question. And yes, I think it's been explored that much, and it might have been explored within sort of, performance settings, and people aren't jumping up and down around how they actually apply the technologies. But again, just using my frame of reference and historically kind of my experiences, I've only ever really used velocity-based training for the big bang for your buck kind of compound movements. But like I said, after going away through Europe during May, I know it's not a single leg, not a single joint exercise, but doing like the single leg variations, people are after slightly more rounded solutions to their programming, integrating the technology. So, I mean, bicep curls and tricep pushdowns, I don't think I've got no interest in worrying about velocity when it comes to that sort of stuff. But I think single leg isolation exercises like you've suggested with a hamstring curl and that kind of thing. This is where practitioners can grab the bull by the horns and start helping the researchers validate our thinking when it comes to how useful can we make integration of these technologies to make performance solutions better. So, you know, from my point of view, it's great that someone's going to ask a question around the single leg variation pieces, but or the single joint activities and what's going to be useful and what's going to be, you know, I guess, enhancing performance for particular player groups. But again, a bit like the peer-reviewed stuff, more research is needed in velocity-based training with more novel solutions as opposed to just the squat, the bench press, the bench pull, the trap bar deadlift. Because when you actually do look through the sort of meta-analysis and all the publishing around velocity-based training, most of it has been around multi-joint, you know, the compound exercises, and not much around, you know, slightly different ways of, you know, improving athleticism or returning players to full health. So it's great that these sort of questions get flagged, because we can then have conversations with researchers around, you know, integrating that, or at least learning more about that and where the value lies.